Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me 10 minutes to sound off. I'm going to be talking mainly about transport. One of the reasons for that is being on a panel is a very good way of ensuring that you don't cover the same ground as anyone else, because no one else ever talks about transport. Transport is not one of the left's sexy issues. We don't go on many demos about transport, and you'd actually be pushed to know what the left's policy is on transport, other than it should be publicly owned and it should probably be a bit better than it is. And I think we need to do better than that to find out. Although having said that, the coronavirus pandemic is probably not the most opportune time to be promoting public transport, because we're all under advice to not travel on it, so as to not spread the virus. However, it should be pointed out that in the interest of rationality, that at any other time other than a global pandemic, public transport is infinitely superior to private transport on many levels. So it's far, far safer. Measure that in deaths per passenger mile, if you like. It's negligible on public transport compared to in cars, lorries, etc. It is healthier. Societies which have better public transport have better health outcomes. It is better for the environment. It's a better, more efficient use of land. It takes up much less land to run public transport than it does private transport. So I've worked on London Underground for 23 years. And I've studied and learned a bit about it in that time. And I did write a book. There you go, I might promote it in the chat in a bit. And as part of my study of the history and governance of London Underground, I came to the conclusion that London Underground's well-being, in terms of how good a service it is, depends on 5 factors, okay? One is its ownership. Is it owned publicly or is it owned privately? 2 is its degree of integration. Is it an integrated whole, or is it broken up by contracting out and separated management, etc.? How well is it funded? Surprisingly enough, the better it's funded, the better service it provides. 4 is its governance, whether its governance is national or local. It does better when it's run by a London body than when it's run by national government, particularly by an elected London body. And 5thly, is its ethos. Is it allowed to run as a public service, as part of our social infrastructure, or is it compelled to operate as a business balancing the books? And reaching those conclusions then leads us on to think, to discuss what you might call beyond nationalisation, because the left does tend to say its answer to ownership of things is nationalise it, and there are various reasons why we've got to say more than that, or in some cases not say it at all. So the first thing I want to do is I do have something of a reputation for pedantry about words, and I'm going to be pedantic here, but it's really, really important, right? Nationalisation and public ownership are not the same thing. Nationalisation means public ownership by the national government, right? So I wouldn't want London Underground to be nationalised. Don't want it owned and run by a national government. It does a lot better when it's publicly owned by a London government. This is particularly pertinent now in the COVID crisis, when we're talking about care homes, and we're seeing terrible, terrible death rates in care homes, which is against a background of decades of care homes being underfunded, contracted out to private companies who run them as cheaply as possible, pay their workers as little as possible, you know, scrimp and save as much as possible in looking after their residents just so they can make a profit. And people want to say, absolutely rightly, bring social care back into public ownership, okay? But please don't say nationalise public social care, because nationalise it means put the national government in charge of it, and therefore you'd be saying that you are against returning it to local authority ownership and control, where I think it would be much better off. So that's a pedantic point about nationalism. If you mean public nationalisation, not nationalism, Freudian slip. If you mean public ownership, say public ownership. Only say nationalisation if you actually mean ownership by the national government. But there's more to beyond nationalisation than that, I think. Particularly because just because something is publicly owned, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. You have to be of a certain age to remember British Rail. And you might, you might remember it fondly if you're wearing your rose-tinted spectacles, or if you're comparing it with the privatised railway now, but you won't remember thinking very fondly of it at the time. It was rubbish, unreliable, the food was terrible. Rampant low pay amongst the workforce. It is not a model of a socialist public transport system. So we need to go beyond this notion of a bureaucratic nationalisation and talk about public ownership under democratic control. It's not good enough to just have public ownership, also needs to be under public control and planned and run in the public common interest, not left to function as a business. And actually, because transport is part of our social infrastructure, planning transport means we can also reshape a lot of other aspects of our lives. We can replan city centres. We can reorganise where people work in relation to where they live, etc. So, in a quick flick back to the 1930s, in the 1930s, London Transport was brought into public ownership on the basis of a plan drafted by Herbert Morrison, the literal and political grandfather of Peter Mandelson, and he did it in what Ernest Bevin, who himself was pretty right-wing and bureaucratic and dreadful, described as positively the worst form of public ownership, because he brought it into public ownership and put it under the control of a London Passenger Transport Board, which consisted mainly of the previous private owners. So it was very much not the sort of thing that I would think we would want to see. What then happened was London Transport was rubbish, and there was near riots on the streets of London. And only at that point was investment made and were the services improved. So there have been some schemes floated down the years about democratic management of public transport, like some nominees from the mayor and some workers' representatives and stuff like that. But I do think it's important to draw a distinction between workers' control of industry and having some workers on the board. Because if you have a board, even if it's, an elected board would be better than the appointed boards we have now. But if it's just an elected board sitting on top of a bureaucratic management structure of the railway service or the transport service, then it's not going to give us what we want. So, in fact, the transport workers' rank and file movements of the 1970s, one of their key demands was no union reps on the London Transport Board, because they didn't want to see union reps co-opted into being bosses, essentially. So rather than having an elected board sit on top of a bureaucratic system, what we need is much more thoroughgoing democracy in the running of public transport. And one thing pretty much every day at work, something happens and someone slags off something management have done and says, well, obviously, we could run it better. It's like an instinctive thing that people know, that workers know better how to run the system. So I think what we need in public transport is we need to pose it not just in terms of nationalise the railways, although we should nationalise the railways, but in terms of a workers and passengers plan. So that public transport, the railway, including the railway industry, should be run by a democratically drafted and agreed workers and passengers plan. What one I would anticipate that would do is improve the accessibility of the railway service, particularly in relation to fares, but also accessibility to disabled people. Also accessibility to rural areas, extending the service into new areas, undoing cuts from the past, making a service that's more reliable, using new technology to improve the service and to work with staff, rather than doing what public transport does at the moment, which is prioritise the use of new technology to extract money from your pocket, rather than to operate the system. So just to finish up in my remaining 1 minute, just to go back to COVID, to the COVID crisis, okay? One thing that's noticeable, isn't it, is that the capitalist ideologues have gone quiet. We've not heard a lot of Adam Smith and Milton Friedman being quoted lately. No one's saying leave it to the market and the market will sort out COVID. And in one sense, that's an opportunity. I hate to sound, that sounds a bit sick, but it's an opportunity because capitalism is exposing how inadequate it is in dealing with crises. But if we're really going to expose that, then we have to explain more clearly what our socialist alternative is. And the socialist alternative is not the government owns stuff and spends a lot of money. That's not what socialism is. Socialism is measured not by how much governments spend, but by how much control workers have. Public services run on socialist lines means them being run democratically by workers and users, because socialism is not the same as state ownership if the state doesn't collectively belong to the working class.